All right, so today we're going to talk about some history stuff. A lot of this will be a review of things that you guys already know. But we're talking about the way things were and the developments that led up to the writing of the Constitution. So we want to make sure that we'll be able to explain all the problems with the Articles of Confederation, and we'll be able to explain how the Constitution addressed those problems. First up, we've got to get some background knowledge about the Enlightenment, the period of time in the 1700s where European thinkers were coming up with new ways of thinking about things, and these were big influences on the framers of the Constitution here in the United States. The founding fathers of the government tried to incorporate these ideas. All right, so first let's talk about what the Enlightenment was. This is a time period in Europe where we've got thinkers that are trying to come up with new answers to questions. They're using the developments of the scientific revolution and applying those to social situations or political situations in this case. Everything before the Enlightenment, when we didn't have an answer to a question, the only source of information was the church. And so the scientific revolution brought about a process of coming up with a hypothesis and trying to test things and using reasoning and logic to answer questions for things that had previously just been explained by the church. And so these philosophers and these thought leaders are explaining social systems in ways that are different from the church. One of the things we want to focus on is they were coming up with ideas about how governments were formed. If you think about all the governments that you studied in history, go back to the earliest ones, we're talking about Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both of those places already had complex governments. So these thinkers are trying to come up with theories about how the very first governments formed. A lot of the thought that takes place in the Enlightenment challenges traditional power structures like the church and the idea of power passing down from generation to generation, what we call the nobility. And they definitely challenge the idea of divine right. This is where rulers justified their place of power by claiming that God chose them to have political power. All right, so the first thinker we want to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes writes this book called The Leviathan, and you will see this famous quote over and over again. He says, "Life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." He is describing, his big idea is what we call the state of nature. He is describing what would life be like without any government at all. So he's talking about like a caveman situation, a hunter-gatherer society where we don't have a complex government. He views that as solitary, poor, nasty. He says it's a constant state of war. Basically, we are always fighting with each other for resources and for survival. His idea about human nature is that people deep down on the inside are just bad. So because people are bad, they need a strong government to control them and keep people safe. People should give up their freedom because the government is going to give them safety and stability. And so he thinks that the only form of government that's going to work is an absolute monarch. So a king with unlimited powers would be the best government because it would be able to control all of these bad people. Later, John Locke comes along. Now, John Locke is going to be way more important to American government. We share a lot of his ideals, but he's building on this idea from Hobbes, from the state of nature. So he's starting at this place before there was a government. To him, he views the state of nature totally differently. So to him, the state of nature is a place of total freedom. So in the state of nature, we have maximum freedom, and this is great. His big idea that we're going to keep with us forever is he comes up with this idea of natural rights. All men have the right to life, to liberty, and to property. And so the point of a government is to protect these rights, to protect your life, to protect your freedoms, and to protect the property. And so he takes an opposite view of Hobbes, where Hobbes thinks deep down on the inside we're all bad. Locke thinks deep down on the inside we're all good. And if the people are all good, we don't really need a government to control us. We just need a government to protect property, to protect freedom, and to protect our life. It's a very limited government because deep down on the inside, we're fine without a government. He agrees with Hobbes about this state of nature idea, but because he feels differently about people, he ends up with a different idea of what the best government would be. And to him, the best government would be a government that has limited powers. And then he also gives us this really important idea that if a government does not do what the people want, then the people should replace the government. And so we're going to see that pop up again in a few minutes when we get to the Declaration of Independence. A couple other guys we'll talk about. One is JeanJacques Rousseau, and he writes this book called The Social Contract. And he's got similar ideas to Locke, but what we care about here is he's got this idea that government forms because people are willing to give up some of their freedoms in exchange for order and stability. Okay, so think of it this way. There are lots of rights that we have, there's lots of freedom that we have that we would willingly give up if it made our life better from day to day. A long time ago, before you guys were born and getting on airplanes, it was totally okay to take a drink with you on the airplane. You could take a bottle of water on the airplane. But then one time we had this situation and there was a threat of a terrorist attack using liquid on an airplane. And so people are scared of terrorist attacks. And as a society, we all willingly gave up the freedom to bring our own drink on the airplane in exchange for the feeling of safety that we've prevented a terrorist attack. A lot of this came into play at the early stages of the coronavirus outbreak. We gave up a lot of freedoms early. As a group, we were willing to give up the freedom to just go hang out with large groups of people. We were willing to give up the freedom to go sit in a restaurant or to go to the movies in exchange for the safety and stability that would come with a quick solution to the problem. And so that's an idea that we use a lot, is people giving up their freedom in exchange for safety or stability. And the other idea here that Rousseau talks about is that the power of the state is supposed to reflect what the people want to do. So this is where we get the idea that the government serves the will of the people. That means the government is supposed to do what the people want it to do. All right, and the last guy is Montesquieu. Now, luckily, we're least likely to see Montesquieu, but the idea that comes from him that we're most concerned about is he developed the idea of a separation of powers, that was the best way to ensure your personal liberty or your freedoms were the most protected. So he came up with the idea of we should have a separate group of people making the legislative decisions, a separate group of people carrying out the executive parts of the government, and a separate group of people exercising the judicial power. So if they depend on each other, they have to work together. And if they're separate from each other, they won't work together to oppress us. So if you think about it this way, Congress passes a law, but they rely on the executive branch to put that law into effect. Both of those branches rely on the judicial branch to interpret that law and those actions. So they each need each other and they each compete with each other. And the good part about a government with separation of powers is as long as the government is fighting with itself, it's not working together to oppress the people. So in that way, our personal freedoms are protected from a government. All right, so those are the main Enlightenment thinkers that we want to make sure we understand their ideas. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. We want to understand how their ideas influenced the ideas of the people designing America's